She's doing okay. She's walking through those stages of grief, and I think once she gets through each stage, she'll be okay. She'll be able to move on. Wow, it's been like 5 or 6 months. I'm really worried. Like I can't believe he's still grieving the loss of his wife. Shouldn't he be like feeling better by now? Just so bummed. I don't know what to do. Physically, he's not here. I don't have a relationship with anymore. That's it. It's over. I just have to close the book and move on. These phrases or comments come from very common grief myths that I'll either hear from my clients or I'll hear in the society or I'll hear from well-intentioned people in support systems. So welcome to the Exposing Grief YouTube channel, where we begin to remove that stigma of grief and expose it for what it truly is, which is a natural and healthy way of living and loving. And what better way to do that than to debunk some of these most common grief myths that we're hearing all around us. So today I want to bring to you the top 5 most common grief myths I hear from clients in the society, from those who are trying to support those who are grieving. So let's not waste another minute and let's jump into our first myth. Let's talk about this first grief myth. And I do this one first every single time, whether I'm doing a workshop or a presentation, or I'm talking to my loved ones about it, or even my clients about it, because I think it's not only the most common, but it's the most surprising when people hear that grief actually doesn't occur in stages, right? So we have this idea that grief has 5 stages, right? The stage of denial, the stage of anger, depression, then bargaining, then acceptance. And the truth is, grief doesn't occur in this fashion. Now, keep in mind, the stages themselves are not wrong, and we may experience some of these stages or some of these emotions throughout our grief process. Where it gets tricky is the stages are placed in the incorrect environment. So here's what I mean by that. These stages were originally developed by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross for someone who was dying. These stages were developed for someone who was in the dying process. It quickly became the most well-known, the most understood, something that people could grab onto. It was tangible. So then it slowly started shifting into the grief world, which then became known as these are the 5 stages of grief, right? And so there can be benefits of like, oh, okay, this gives me a very clear idea, kind of a map of how a grief journey works. Because oftentimes clients are like, I don't even, what am I supposed to do? What does this look like? Right? So these stages can be comforting for some people because it tells them like, this is what I have to do. But there's danger in it because when we then experience the very common thing of not going from one stage to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, it's like, is something wrong with me? What's going on? Am I crazy? So again, the stages are not incorrect themselves. They're just placed in the wrong environment. They were meant for someone who is dying, not for someone who is grieving. And disclaimer, that doesn't mean to say you won't experience anger or you won't experience depression throughout your grief journey. It's just the idea that we don't go from one to the next, to the next. And then once we do all 5, we're done, right? So grief does not occur in stages. Grief myth number 2 kind of branches off this idea that grief doesn't occur in stages, and it's this idea that grief is not a linear process. So part of why grief doesn't occur in stages is because when it does, if it had that idea that grief was from one stage to the next, it implies that it's a very streamlined process, right? We do this first, and then when we finish that, we go to this, and then when we finish that, we go to this, and that's just not how grief works. Actually, there's a lot of things in life and therapy that doesn't work that way. We can be doing this and chugging along, up, and then we run into an obstacle, a barrier, so we have to go around, or we feel like we're going back. I have a lot of clients or people come to me that say like, yeah, I felt like I was doing fine, and then I got triggered, and it felt like it put me right back at where I was at the beginning. That's okay, right? That's part of the process. We are going to do this back and forth, up and down, scramble kind of in the middle and feel like, right? It's not a streamlined linear process. So taking it out of the stages format gives people permission to recognize like, this is okay. This is healthy if I feel like I'm bouncing back and forth. And one big thing I like to really remind people and my clients of is when we do feel like we jump back to square one, wherever that is, it doesn't mean all the work that we had done leading up to that point goes away. Sure, it can feel that way, and I understand that, right? I get that. That's hard. We want to be able to create space of, yes, it feels like I'm back at square one, and now I have all these tools that I've learned along the way to help me navigate this. So grief is not a linear process. You will bounce back and forth. That is okay. Grief myth number 3 of the top 5 is the last one that will branch off what we've already talked about. So this idea of grief not occurring in stages and grief not being a linear process. So with that being said, there is no timeline to grief. We can't say your grieving starts here, and then by the time you get here, your grieving is done. You're done with this grief process. It's just not true. We might be able to say that typically the grief will start at the time of hearing of the passing or around the funeral, but that also isn't the case. Depending on what we're working with or what we're seeing, we might start experiencing that grief before the person even passes. So this idea of anticipatory grief, which is a whole separate topic that we could talk about that we may or may not find come on this YouTube channel. But yes, it's this form of anticipatory grief, which is this whole separate thing, which that process is going to look different than your grieving process when the person is actually gone. So with this idea of we can't pinpoint a particular starting grieving point and an ending grieving point, there is no timeline, but also this idea of there's different types of grief, which I do have a blog on that. If you are interested, I have the link below that talks about what are the different types of grief, because there are different types. That influences what our process and our time process, there is no timeline, what our process looks like. So if you're feeling like there's a certain timeline or time limit on how you should be grieving and how long, I want to encourage you to start challenging that and start looking at, this is me. I'm going to go through this process in a way and in a pace that feels okay for me, because grief has no timeline. Grief myth number 4. Now this one arguably is one of my favorites, if not my number 1 favorite grief myth that I like to talk about, because it really hits on one of the main things I walk my clients through and work on them with, this idea that death ends a life, not a relationship. What? I know, I get it. It can be kind of a weird thing of, how do I maintain a relationship with somebody who's physically not here? It is possible. Yes, it's going to look very, very different. And I work with people who say, like, but I don't want that kind of relationship. I want the relationship where they are here. Of course you do. Why wouldn't you? We all want that. So we do that work and then hopefully start debunking this myth to provide hope that you can still have a relationship with that loved one. It's just going to look very different. And that's okay when you get to that point. Right? So this grief myth hopefully instills that hope of, okay, I can't have the relationship I used to have or that I maybe really want to have, but I can still have a relationship with my loved one, because death can't take that away. It can change it, but it can't take it away. So if you're ever feeling doubtful about being connected or maintaining a relationship with your loved one who has passed, I hear you 100%. That's very common. Don't feel like you're alone or you're crazy or you're strange. No. That's a very valid, healthy desire to still want a relationship with your person even after they're gone. I want to remove or challenge this myth for you of it is possible. We just have to find a way that is possible for you. How does maintaining a relationship with your loved one make sense to you? And that's what I would encourage you to start exploring. If you were to continue maintaining a relationship with your loved one, what would that look like? How would you do that? What would be involved? Start exploring that and see what you come up with. Feel free to comment below if you'd like, or reach out to me and share some of your thoughts, or if you have any questions, but I would love to hear what you come up with. And if you get stuck, let's work on it together. It's a very different and can be a tough process. So let's work on it together. Let's figure out how you can stay connected to your loved one, because death ends a life, not a relationship. Grief myth number 5, our last and final grief myth for the day. It's this idea that the end goal of grief is to move on. Mm-mm. We don't move on from grief. We will always be grieving in some fashion, in some form after we've lost our loved one, right? Just like we will always love them in some fashion and form. Grief is a part of love, right? So we can't move on from that. Now, keep in mind when I talk to clients or when clients hear about, or not even a client, just anybody hears about, I'll be grieving forever. You mean to tell me I'm going to feel this way forever? No, I understand how hearing that it's like, oh my gosh, I don't want to feel this way forever. This is terrible. It's this idea that yes, we will be grieving in some sort of fashion throughout the rest of our life, but the frequency will become less, the intensity will become less. We'll have more tools and different ways to navigate it and manage it. So the grief will feel more manageable and attainable, but the grief will always be there. So with that, one, there cannot be an end goal. And if there were, it can't be that we move on from it. Instead, I want to encourage you to look at your grief process as one that will grow into you learning how to carry this loss with you as you continue to make strides in your life. If we carry that loss with us, it's like this person is involved, right? We're not moving on without them. We're bringing them with us, just in a different fashion. So there is no end goal to grief. And if there were one, it definitely would not be move on from grief. Rather, our goal is, how can I continue walking through my process and carrying this loss with me as I make new strides in my life? There is no end goal to grief, and it is definitely not move on. There you have it. We have debunked, we have shattered, we have challenged, and whatever other word you want to put on there, these top 5 grief myths. This idea that grief occurs in stages, that grief is a linear process, that grief has a timeline, that death ends both a life and a relationship, and that our end goal of grief is to move on. No. We've shattered all those. We debunked those, and hopefully I've given you a different light to view grief. I've given you a space to start looking at grief and going, okay, this feels more manageable. This feels okay. Or you might be going, what? I had no idea. Or you might go, yeah, I knew that. Either way, I hope you feel validated. I hope you feel seen. I hope you feel heard in your grief process. Keep in mind, just because we covered the top 5 today doesn't mean that there aren't more out there. I'm sure there are plenty of myths that you have heard, and I'd love to hear what they are. So if you want to share what some that you have heard, please feel free to comment below or reach out to me via email or on my social media platforms. I'd love to hear what other people are hearing from society, from family members, well-intentioned, but sometimes we can hear some things that it's like, oh, I don't like that. So these were just the top 5, the most common that I will come across and that I'll talk with people about. But like I said, I'm sure there are more out there. So please feel free to share those if you'd like to. If you ever feel stuck or lost or wondering, like, is this normal? Review these. Start exploring some of the things we talked about, right? To start challenging these myths in how they show up for you, right? Go back and start exploring some of those things that we talked about so you can really start shaping your grief process in a way that looks true and authentic to you. I want to thank you so much for joining me this month. I'm so excited that you are here. Please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of the content coming later this month. I have an interview with a gal who does death charts, and she's going to talk about how that can influence and benefit our grief process. It's pretty cool. It's a different thing. So I'm excited to be bringing that to you, and any other kind of education, tips, tricks, all that kind of stuff. So be sure to subscribe to the Exposing Grief YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing. Don't ever hesitate to reach out to me with any questions, comments, anything. You can email me, comment below, reach me on my social media. I am here for you. Have a happy day, a wonderful March, and go out there and start debunking some of these myths for yourself. Take care.